The October rain drummed against the funeral home windows like impatient fingers, matching the rhythm of my racing heart. Each droplet seemed to echo the hollow thud in my chest that had been there since the phone call 3 days ago. Dad's casket sat surrounded by wilted lilies and forced smiles, while I stood frozen in my black dress, the same one I'd worn to my college graduation just 8 months earlier, when Dad had beamed with pride from the third row. The funeral home smelled like industrial-strength air freshener trying to mask something darker underneath. People I barely recognized kept approaching me with tear-stained faces, sharing memories of my father that felt foreign to my ears. He was such a good man, they'd say, or he always had time to help others. Each comment was like a small knife, reminding me that other people had pieces of Dad that I'd never fully known. Sarah, honey, you look exhausted. Uncle Mark's voice cut through the fog of grief like a lifeline thrown to a drowning person. His warm hand landed on my shoulder with the same gentle pressure he'd used when teaching me to ride a bike 15 years ago, back when the world made sense and adults seemed capable of fixing everything. Why don't you sit down? I'll handle the rest of the arrangements. At 23, I felt like a child again. Lost, overwhelmed, and desperate for someone to take control. The past few days had been a blur of hospital corridors, doctor consultations, and funeral arrangements that I was completely unprepared to handle. Mark had always been Dad's favorite brother, the successful one with the corner office at Morrison & Associates law firm downtown. His silver hair was perfectly styled even in this chaos, his navy suit crisp despite the humidity that made everyone else look wilted. I remembered countless family barbecues where Mark would arrive in his expensive car, bringing stories about high-profile cases and important clients. Dad would listen with obvious admiration, occasionally asking legal questions about his business or investments. Mark's the smart one in the family, Dad used to say with a proud smile. Got the brains for law while I just learned to fix things with my hands. The contrast between the brothers had always been stark, but affectionate. Dad worked construction management, came home dirty and tired but satisfied with honest work. Mark worked in glass towers, wore suits that cost more than Dad's monthly salary, and seemed to glide through life with the confidence that came from never doubting your own intelligence. I don't know what I'm supposed to do, I whispered, my voice cracking. The lawyer keeps calling about probate court, and there are all these forms, and I can't even think straight. Mark's brown eyes, so similar to Dad's, filled with what looked like genuine concern. Listen to me, Sarah. Your dad and I talked about this possibility. He was worried about leaving you to handle everything alone. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through what appeared to be text messages. See? He sent me this last month. If anything happens to me, please help Sarah with the legal stuff. She's brilliant, but she shouldn't have to navigate this nightmare alone. The message felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning person. Dad had always been protective, always thinking 3 steps ahead. Of course he would have made arrangements. He really said that? I asked, wiping my nose with a tissue that had somehow appeared in my hand. Your father was my best friend before he was my brother, Mark said, his voice thick with emotion. I've been handling estates for 20 years. Let me take care of the paperwork while you grieve properly. That's what family does. The funeral director approached us with a clipboard, speaking in hushed tones about final arrangements and payment schedules. I felt my chest tighten as the numbers swirled together. Cremation costs, venue rental, flowers, obituary fees. Everything. Required immediate decisions I wasn't prepared to make. I've got this, Mark said smoothly, pulling out his checkbook. Consider it handled. We'll sort out the reimbursement later from the estate. Relief flooded through me like warm water. For the first time in 3 days, I could breathe without feeling like my lungs were filled with concrete. The next morning, Mark arrived at Dad's house, my house now, I reminded myself, carrying 2 steaming coffee cups and a leather briefcase that screamed expensive lawyer. Colombian dark roast, 2 sugars, splash of cream, he said, handing me the cup. Just like your dad taught you to drink it. The coffee was perfect, and the gesture made my throat tight with emotion. Mark had remembered Dad's little lessons, the way he'd shown me the proper way to make coffee when I was 16 and desperate to seem sophisticated. We sat at Dad's kitchen table, the same oak surface where I'd done homework, eaten countless bowls of cereal, and had our last real conversation. Just 2 weeks ago, Mark spread out documents with practiced efficiency, his gold wedding band catching the morning light. Okay, here's what we're dealing with, he said, pointing to a stack of papers. The house is worth about $400,000 in today's market. Your dad's 401k has roughly $250,000. There's a life insurance policy for $300,000, plus his savings accounts and investment portfolio. My head spun with the numbers. I'd known Dad was comfortable, but hearing it laid out like this made it real in a way that felt overwhelming. That's almost $1 million, I stammered. Your father worked hard his entire life, Mark said gently. He wanted to make sure you were taken care of. But here's the thing. Probate court is going to be a nightmare. The process usually takes 6 to 12 months, sometimes longer if there are complications. During that time, all assets are frozen. Frozen? You can't access the money, can't sell the house, can't touch anything until the court approves the will and all debts are settled. Meanwhile, you still have mortgage payments, property taxes, utilities. It's designed to protect creditors, but it leaves families in financial limbo. The weight of responsibility settled on my shoulders like a lead blanket. I'd been working part-time at a local marketing firm while finishing my master's degree. My savings account had maybe $3,000. What am I supposed to do? I asked, panic creeping into my voice. Mark leaned forward, his expression serious but reassuring. This is where having a lawyer in the family helps. I can expedite certain processes, file motions to release funds for essential expenses, navigate the bureaucracy. But I need you to trust me completely and let me handle everything. Of course I trust you, I said immediately. Your family. Good. Then here's what we're going to do. He pulled out a manila folder thick with documents. I need you to sign some papers giving me power of attorney to act on your behalf in all estate matters. This allows me to file documents, communicate with the court, handle financial institutions, basically everything your dad would have done if he were here. The papers looked official and intimidating, full of legal language that might as well have been written in ancient Greek. But Mark was explaining each section patiently, pointing out where my signature was needed. This form authorizes me to access your father's bank accounts to pay ongoing expenses from estate funds, he said, flipping to page 3. This one allows me to communicate with his financial advisor, and this gives me authority to handle any property-related issues. I signed where he indicated, trusting that Mark knew what he was doing. Each signature felt like passing a burden to someone stronger, someone capable of handling what I couldn't. Now, there's one more thing, Mark said, his tone becoming more serious. Your dad's will is pretty straightforward. Everything goes to you. But there might be some complications. What kind of complications? Mark shifted uncomfortably in his chair, running his hand through his silver hair. Your father had some business dealings that weren't entirely above board. Nothing criminal, he added quickly, seeing my expression. But some creative tax strategies that could attract IRS attention during probate. My stomach dropped. What does that mean? It means we need to be very careful about how we handle certain assets. If the IRS decides to audit the estate, they could freeze everything for years. But I have ways to structure things that minimize risk. He pulled out another set of documents. These forms essentially create a family trust with you as the primary beneficiary. It protects the assets from potential government seizure while the estate is being settled. The papers looked even more complex than the first set, with multiple signature lines and notarization requirements. But Mark was my father's brother, a successful lawyer, and the only person standing between me and financial ruin. I know it's a lot to take in, he said gently. But your dad specifically asked me to handle things this way if anything happened to him. He was worried about leaving you vulnerable. I signed the trust documents, watching Mark's satisfied smile as he collected the papers and tucked them back into his briefcase. You did the right thing, Sarah, he said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. Your dad would be proud of how you're handling this. Over the next few weeks, Mark became my lifeline. He called every few days with updates, handled the flood of condolence calls and casserole deliveries, and somehow managed to get the mortgage payments deferred while probate was pending. The court clerk is being difficult about the expedited filing, he told me during one of our coffee meetings. But I have a relationship with Judge Peterson. Should be able to get things moving by next month. I nodded, grateful to have someone else dealing with the bureaucratic maze. Mark seemed to have connections everywhere. The courthouse, the bank, even the insurance company that was processing Dad's life insurance claim. Any word on when I might be able to access some of the funds? I asked. My savings were running dangerously low, and even with the deferred mortgage, I still had utilities, groceries, and car payments to worry about. Soon, Mark promised. I'm working on getting the court to release funds for living expenses. Should have good news by the end of next week. But the end of next week came and went without any updates. When I called Mark's office, his secretary said he was in court all day. When I tried his cell phone, it went straight to voicemail. Finally, after 3 days of radio silence, Mark called back. Sorry, Sarah. This case has been more complicated than I expected. The court is asking for additional documentation about your father's business interests. Nothing to worry about, just bureaucratic red tape. What kind of documentation? Bank records, investment statements, that sort of thing. I'm handling it, but it's slowing down the process. I could hear papers shuffling in the background, the sound of a busy office. Mark was juggling multiple cases, and I was just one of many responsibilities on his plate. Is there anything I can do to help? I asked. Actually, yes. I need you to sign one more form. The court wants confirmation that you're aware of all estate assets. It's routine, but required. He arrived at my house that afternoon with another document, this one shorter than the previous ones, but still filled with legal terminology that made my head hurt. What exactly am I confirming? I asked, trying to parse the language. Just that you've been made aware of all assets and that you consent to my handling of the estate according to your father's wishes, Mark explained. Standard stuff, but the court won't move forward without it. I signed the form, but something nagged at me. Maybe it was the way Mark avoided eye contact, or how quickly he tucked the paper away before I could read it more carefully. Mark, I said as he was putting on his coat. You'd tell me if there were any problems, right? If something was wrong with the estate? He turned to face me, his expression serious but reassuring. Sarah, I give you my word, as your uncle and as your lawyer, that I will always be completely honest with you about your father's estate. Your family. I would never do anything to hurt you. The sincerity in his voice chased away my doubts. Mark had been nothing but helpful since Dad's death, sacrificing his own time and resources to guide me through an impossible situation. But as I watched his car disappear down the tree-lined street, I couldn't shake the feeling that something important was happening just outside my understanding, like trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. The November wind whipped through the bare branches outside Dad's kitchen window, carrying the scent of approaching winter and the promise of colder days ahead. I'd been living in the house for 6 weeks now, surrounded by his belongings and the growing pile of bills that Mark assured me would be handled any day now. Every room held memories that felt both comforting and painful. The coffee mug Dad always used, still sitting in the dish drainer, his reading glasses on the kitchen counter, the newspaper folded to the crossword puzzle he'd never finished. The financial pressure was becoming unbearable, like a weight pressing down on my chest every time I opened the mailbox. My part-time job at Creative Solutions Marketing barely covered groceries, and despite Mark's repeated promises, no funds had been released from the estate. I'd maxed out my credit card paying for Dad's final prescriptions that insurance wouldn't cover, and the utility company had started sending disconnect notices printed on ominous yellow paper. The mortgage payment alone was $1,800 a month, more than I made in 6 weeks at my current job. Property taxes were due in January. The homeowner's insurance needed renewal. Each bill felt like another shovelful of dirt on a grave I was digging for my own financial future. I don't understand why this is taking so long, I told Mark during our weekly check-in call. You said it would be a few weeks. These things always take longer than expected, he replied. But his voice sounded different. Distracted, maybe even annoyed. The court system is backed up, and your father's estate is more complex than we initially thought. Complex how? There was a pause, long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Then Mark cleared his throat. The IRS has some questions about his business deductions from the last few years. Nothing serious. But they want documentation before approving the estate distribution. What kind of documentation? Financial records, mostly. I'm working with his accountant to compile everything they need. Should be resolved within the month. But the month came and went with no resolution. When I called Mark's office, his secretary, a woman named Diane, who had always been friendly before, now sounded curt and evasive. Mr. Morrison is in meetings all day, she would say. I'll have him call you back. The callbacks became less frequent, and when Mark did call, our conversations grew shorter and more vague. Just hang in there a little longer, became his standard response to my questions about timing. It was during one of these increasingly frustrating conversations that I made a decision that would change everything. Mark, I want to see the probate file, I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. What? The probate file. I want to see what's been filed with the court, what documents you've submitted, what the status actually is. Another long pause. Sarah, that's not necessary. I'm handling everything according to standard procedure. I know you are, but I'm an adult, and this is my father's estate. I have a right to see the paperwork. Of course you do, Mark said quickly. I'll get copies made for you, but honestly, it's just a bunch of legal jargon that won't make much sense without proper context. I'd still like to see it. Fine. I'll drop off copies this weekend. Saturday came and went. Sunday too. Monday morning, I decided to take matters into my own hands. The courthouse was an imposing granite building downtown, with marble floors, that echoed every footstep like thunder and fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly sick and exhausted. I'd driven past it countless times but never had reason to enter, and now its imposing facade felt like a fortress designed to keep ordinary people out. The directory mounted near the security checkpoint pointed me toward the probate clerk's office on the 3rd floor, up a grand staircase that had probably intimidated visitors for the better part of a century. My heels clicked against the marble as I climbed, each step feeling heavier than the last. Other people moved through the corridors with the purposeful stride of those who belonged here. Lawyers in expensive suits, court clerks carrying thick files, families huddled together discussing cases in hushed tones. I felt like an intruder, someone who had wandered into a world where I didn't understand the rules or the language. The probate clerk's office was a cramped space behind a wall of bulletproof glass, with waiting room chairs that looked like they'd been uncomfortable since the 1970s. The clerk, a tired-looking woman in her 50s with graying hair and reading glasses hanging from a chain, barely looked up when I approached her window. She had the weary expression of someone who had delivered bad news to desperate people more times than she cared to count. I'd like to see the probate file for Robert James Thompson, I said, my heart pounding. He died in October. She typed something into her computer, frowned, and typed some more. I don't show any probate filing for that name, she said finally. What do you mean? No probate case has been opened for Robert James Thompson. Are you sure about the spelling? I showed her Dad's death certificate pointing to his full legal name. She checked again, then shook her head. Nothing. If someone died in October and had assets requiring probate, the filing should have been made within 30 days. We're now approaching 3 months. The floor seemed to tilt beneath my feet. But my uncle is handling everything. He's a lawyer. He said he filed all the necessary paperwork. Ma'am, I can only tell you what's in our system. No probate case has been opened for this individual. I stumbled out of the courthouse in a daze, my mind racing with implications I didn't want to consider. Maybe Mark had filed in a different county. Maybe there was a mistake in the computer system. Maybe I had misunderstood something fundamental about the process. But deep down, a cold certainty was spreading through my chest like ice water. I drove straight to Mark's law firm, a gleaming office building in the business district with Morrison, and associates emblazoned in gold letters across the entrance. I'd been there once before, years ago, when Dad and I had visited during the holidays. The receptionist, a young woman with perfectly styled blonde hair, looked up with a practiced smile. "I'm here to see Mark Morrison," I said. "I'm his niece, Sarah Thompson. Do you have an appointment?" "No, but it's about my father's estate. It's urgent." She picked up the phone, spoke quietly, then hung up with a frown. "I'm sorry, but Mr. Morrison is in court all afternoon. Can I schedule something for later this week?" "What about Diane? His secretary?" The receptionist's expression grew confused. "I'm sorry, who?" "Diane. Mark's secretary. I've spoken with her several times." "Mr. Morrison doesn't have a secretary named Diane. I handle all his calls directly." The world started spinning around me. "That's impossible. I've been speaking with Diane for months about my father's estate." "Ma'am, I've been Mr. Morrison's only assistant for 3 years. There's no one named Diane working here." I left the law firm in a state of shock, my hands trembling as I started the car. Someone named Diane had been answering Mark's phone, making excuses for his unavailability, scheduling our meetings. If she didn't work at his firm, then who was she? That night, I sat at Dad's kitchen table with a legal pad, trying to make sense of the timeline. I wrote down every conversation with Mark, every promise, every excuse. The pattern that emerged was deeply disturbing. Mark had power of attorney over all estate matters. He had access to Dad's bank accounts. He'd convinced me to sign documents, creating a family trust. And apparently, he'd never filed for probate at all. I called my college roommate, Jennifer, who was now a paralegal at a firm in Chicago. "Jen, I need to ask you something about probate law," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Sure, what's up?" "If someone dies and leaves assets, how long does the executor have to file for probate?" "Usually 30 days, sometimes up to 90, depending on the state." "Why?" "And if they don't file?" "That's a big problem. The assets remain in limbo, and technically, anyone could petition the court to be named administrator. It's actually considered abandonment of fiduciary duty." Her voice became concerned. "Sarah, is everything okay with your dad's estate?" I told her everything. Mark's promises, the delays, the discovery that no probate case had been filed. Jennifer listened without interrupting, but I could hear her sharp intake of breath when I described the trust documents. "Sarah, you need to get copies of everything you signed, tonight, and you need to find out exactly what assets your father had and where they are right now." "How do I do that?" "Start with his bank statements. If your uncle has power of attorney, he should be able to provide complete financial records. If he can't or won't, that's a huge red flag." After we hung up, I went through Dad's desk systematically. He'd been organized to a fault, keeping meticulous records of everything from grocery receipts to investment statements. But I couldn't find any recent bank statements or financial documents. I did find his address book, filled with contacts written in his careful handwriting. I flipped to the B section and found his bank, First National, with a phone number and even the name of his personal banker, someone called Patricia Wells. The next morning, I called the bank. "Ms. Wells, this is Sarah Thompson, Robert Thompson's daughter. He passed away in October, and I'm trying to get information about his accounts. Oh, Sarah, I'm so sorry for your loss. Your father was such a wonderful man. Thank you. I was wondering if you could help me understand the status of his accounts? My uncle Mark Morrison has been handling the estate. Of course, let me pull up the account information. I heard typing, then a long pause. That's strange. What's strange? Well, Mr. Morrison was here last month with power of attorney documents. He said he needed to consolidate your father's accounts for estate planning purposes. But according to my records, all the accounts were closed, and the funds were transferred to a trust account. My heart started racing. What kind of trust account? The Thompson Family Trust. Mr. Morrison said you had established it to manage the estate assets during probate. Do you have records of where the money went? I can't give you specific details over the phone, but if you come in with proper identification, I can show you the transfer documents. I was at the bank within an hour, my hands shaking as I presented my driver's license and Dad's death certificate. Patricia Wells was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a concerned expression. I have to tell you, I was surprised when Mr. Morrison closed the accounts, she said, spreading documents across her desk. Your father had been very specific about wanting to maintain separate accounts for different purposes. The transfer documents showed that Dad's checking account, savings account, and money market account, totaling over $180,000, had all been moved to the Thompson Family Trust on November 15th, just 2 weeks after I'd signed the trust paperwork. Where is this trust account? I asked. Patricia checked her computer. It shows as an external transfer to Pinnacle Private Banking. That's not one of our partner institutions. Can you tell me anything else about the transfer? Mr. Morrison presented valid power of attorney documents and proper identification. The transfer was processed according to standard procedures. She paused, studying my face. Is there a problem with the estate administration? I didn't know how to answer that question. Was there a problem? Or was I being paranoid about normal estate procedures? I'm just trying to understand the process, I said carefully. But driving home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something crucial. Why would Mark move Dad's money to a bank I'd never heard of? Why hadn't he mentioned Pinnacle Private Banking during any of our conversations? That evening, I decided to do some research. I Googled Pinnacle Private Banking and found a sleek website advertising wealth management services for high-net-worth individuals. Their minimum account balance was $500,000. I also Googled Thompson Family Trust, along with various combinations of Mark's name in the bank. Nothing came up in any public records or legal databases. Finally, I searched for Mark's law firm, Morrison and Associates. What I found made my blood run cold. According to the State Bar Association website, Morrison and Associates had been dissolved 6 months ago due to ethical violations and client fund misappropriation. Mark Morrison's law license was currently suspended pending a disciplinary hearing. My uncle, the man I'd trusted with my father's entire estate, wasn't even legally allowed to practice law. I stared at the computer screen until my eyes burned, reading and rereading the State Bar Association's disciplinary notice. The language was formal and cold, but the implications were devastating. Mark Morrison's law license had been suspended for commingling client funds with personal accounts and failure to maintain proper trust account records. The disciplinary hearing was scheduled for next month, but the suspension had been effective since September, a full month before Dad died. My hands trembled as I picked up my phone and dialed Jennifer's number. It was nearly midnight, but she answered on the second ring. Sarah? What's wrong? Jen, I need help. Mark's law license has been suspended. He's not even supposed to be practicing law. What? Are you sure? I read her the disciplinary notice word for word, my voice breaking as I reached the part about client fund misappropriation. Oh my God, Jennifer whispered. Sarah, you need to call the police, tonight. What am I supposed to tell them? That my uncle might be stealing from me? I don't have proof of anything. You have proof that he's practicing law without a license, that he's moved your father's money to accounts you can't access, and that he's been lying to you for months. That's enough to start an investigation. But I couldn't bring myself to call the police on my own uncle. Despite everything, he was still family. There had to be an explanation, some misunderstanding that could be cleared up. Instead, I decided to confront him directly. The next morning, I drove to Mark's house in the affluent Riverside neighborhood, where he lived with his wife Carol in a sprawling colonial that had always intimidated me as a child. The circular driveway was empty except for Carol's silver Mercedes, and the house looked strangely quiet. Carol answered the door in her bathrobe, her usually perfect hair disheveled, and her eyes red-rimmed. "Sarah," she said, not opening the screen door, "this isn't a good time. I need to talk to Mark about Dad's estate. It's important. Mark isn't here. When will he be back?" Carol's face crumpled, and she began to sob. "He's gone, Sarah. He left 3 days ago, packed a suitcase and said he had to go away for a while." The world tilted sideways. "What do you mean, gone?" "I don't know where he is. He won't answer his phone. The bank called yesterday saying our checking account has been frozen. I don't understand what's happening." I stepped closer to the screen door. "Carol, I need to ask you something. Did Mark ever mention moving Dad's money to something called Pinnacle Private Banking?" She wiped her nose with a tissue. "I don't know anything about your father's estate. Mark said he was handling it pro bono as a favor to family. Did he say anything about a Thompson family trust?" "Sarah, I honestly don't know what you're talking about. Mark has been acting strange for months, taking mysterious phone calls, working late. Last week he came home and said we might need to sell the house." My stomach dropped. "Sell the house?" "He said there were some business complications, that we might need liquid assets quickly. I thought he was having a midlife crisis." I left Carol's house with my head spinning. Mark had disappeared, taking who knew how much money with him. Carol was clearly in the dark about his activities, which meant I was completely on my own. Back at Dad's house, I forced myself to think, systematically. If Mark had stolen Dad's money, there would be a paper trail. I just had to find it. I started with the documents he'd given me to sign. Reading them carefully for the first time, I realized how cleverly they'd been worded. The power of attorney wasn't just for estate administration. It gave Mark broad authority to manage all financial affairs of the deceased. The trust documents were even more troubling. Buried in the legal language was a clause making Mark the successor trustee if the original trustee became incapacitated or unavailable. Since I was technically the original trustee but had given him power to act on my behalf, Mark had effectively made himself the controller of the trust. I called Pinnacle Private Banking, hoping to get information about the Thompson Family Trust account. "I'm sorry, but I can't discuss account details over the phone," the customer service representative said. "The account holder would need to come in person with proper identification." "I am the account holder. This is the Thompson Family Trust, and I'm Sarah Thompson." "Ma'am, our records show Mark Morrison as the primary account holder and sole signatory. You're not listed as having access to this account." The room started spinning. Mark had not only moved Dad's money to an account I couldn't access, he'd made himself the sole owner. "Can you at least tell me the current balance?" I asked desperately. "I can't provide any account information to unauthorized parties. If you believe you should have access to this account, you'll need to provide legal documentation establishing your rights." After I hung up, I sat in Dad's kitchen staring at the phone, trying to process the magnitude of what had happened. Mark hadn't just delayed the estate settlement. He'd systematically stolen everything Dad had worked for his entire life. I thought about Dad's life insurance policy. The one Mark had mentioned was worth $300,000. I found the insurance company's number in Dad's address book and called them directly. "Yes, we did receive a claim for Robert Thompson's policy," the claims adjuster told me. Payment was made last month to the designated beneficiary. Who was the designated beneficiary? According to our records, Mark Morrison. He provided the death certificate and proper identification. The check was sent to his address. But I'm Robert's daughter. Shouldn't I be the beneficiary? Ma'am, our records show a beneficiary change form filed 2 years ago, naming Mark Morrison as the primary beneficiary. If you believe this is incorrect, you'll need to provide documentation supporting your claim. I hung up feeling like I was drowning. The life insurance money was gone too. Mark had somehow convinced Dad to change the beneficiary, or, more likely, he'd forged the change forms. That afternoon, I called the one person I thought might have answers, Dad's financial advisor, Richard Kowalski. Dad had mentioned him occasionally, usually in the context of retirement planning and investment strategies. "Sarah, I'm so sorry about your father," Richard said when I reached him. "He was a good man and a careful investor. Richard, I need to ask you about Dad's investment accounts. My uncle has been handling the estate, but I'm having trouble getting information." "What kind of information?" "Just basic stuff. Account balances, where the money is now, that sort of thing." There was a pause. "Sarah, I haven't heard from your uncle. In fact, I've been trying to reach your father's estate representative for weeks. There are some quarterly distributions that need to be processed, and no one has responded to my calls." "What quarterly distributions?" "Your father had about $400,000 in managed investments that generate regular income. The Q4 distribution was supposed to be processed in December, but I haven't received any instructions on where to send the funds." My heart started racing. "Richard, my uncle told me he was handling all of Dad's financial affairs. He said he'd been in contact with you. I've never spoken to anyone about your father's accounts except your father himself. Who exactly is your uncle?" "Mark Morrison. He's a lawyer, or was a lawyer. He had power of attorney." "I don't have any power of attorney documents on file, and I would need to see proper documentation before releasing any account information or funds to a third party." Relief flooded through me. At least some of Dad's money was still safe, still under the control of a legitimate financial institution. "Richard, I need to meet with you as soon as possible. I think my uncle may have been stealing from the estate." "That's a serious accusation, Sarah. But if you're the sole heir, and you have proper documentation, I can certainly help you understand your father's financial situation." We scheduled a meeting for the next morning. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had an ally in my corner. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Mark's disappearance, about Carol's tears, about the money that had vanished into accounts I couldn't access. But I also thought about Dad's investment accounts, about the quarterly distribution that was waiting to be processed, about the possibility that not everything was lost. At 3 a.m., I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to fight back. I spent the rest of the night researching attorneys who specialized in estate fraud. I found several firms that offered free consultations, and I scheduled appointments with 3 of them for later in the week. I also started documenting everything I could remember about my interactions with Mark: dates, times, specific conversations, promises made and broken. If I was going to accuse my uncle of theft, I needed to be prepared to prove it. By dawn, I had filled 6 pages with notes and had a plan of action. Mark might have gotten a head start, but he'd made a crucial mistake. He'd left behind a paper trail, and he'd assumed I would never be smart enough or brave enough to follow it. He was about to learn just how wrong he was. The law office of Patterson and Associates occupied the 23rd floor of a downtown skyscraper with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city sprawling in all directions. From this height, the streets looked like carefully planned grids, the cars like toys, and the people like ants moving with mysterious purpose. It was the kind of view that was supposed to inspire confidence and success, but mostly it made me feel small and insignificant. Attorney Lisa Patterson was younger than I'd expected, maybe mid-30s, with sharp brown eyes behind designer glasses and an air of controlled intensity that immediately made me feel more confident. Her handshake was firm, her smile genuine but professional, and her office was decorated with diplomas, legal awards, and what appeared to be thank you letters from grateful clients. "Tell me everything," she said, sliding a legal pad across her mahogany desk. The pad was already open to a fresh page, her pen poised to capture every detail. "Start from the beginning, and don't leave out any details, no matter how small they might seem. Sometimes the seemingly insignificant moments are the ones that matter most in cases like this." I spent the next hour and 15 minutes recounting the entire story. Dad's sudden death from a heart attack, Mark's immediate appearance with promises of help, the signed documents that I'd barely read, the discovery that no probate case had been filed, the revelation about his suspended law license, the money transferred to mysterious accounts at Pinnacle Private Banking, and his sudden disappearance just as I was starting to ask the right questions. Lisa took notes throughout my narrative, occasionally asking clarifying questions about dates or specific conversations. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair with a grim expression. "Sarah, I need to be completely honest with you. This is one of the most systematic cases of estate fraud I've ever seen. Your uncle didn't just steal money, he orchestrated an elaborate scheme to gain control of your entire inheritance. Can we get it back? We can try. But first, we need to understand exactly what we're dealing with." She pulled out her phone and dialed a number. "Richard, it's Lisa Patterson. I have a new client who I think you should meet." An hour later, we were sitting in the conference room at Kowalski Financial Services, with Dad's complete investment portfolio spread across the table. Richard was a man in his 60s with kind eyes and a methodical way of explaining complex financial concepts. "Your father was very conservative with his investments," he said, pointing to various account statements. "He had about $420,000 in managed funds, all designed to provide steady growth and regular income. The accounts were set up to benefit you exclusively upon his death. But Mark told me Dad had some questionable business dealings that might attract IRS attention," I said. Richard shook his head firmly. "Your father was meticulous about his taxes. Every investment was legitimate, every transaction properly documented. There's nothing here that would interest the IRS." Lisa made a note on her legal pad. "So that was another lie, designed to make you feel like you needed Mark's help to avoid legal problems. What about the life insurance?" I asked. Richard pulled out another file. "This is where things get complicated. I have records showing that your father changed his life insurance beneficiary about 18 months ago. But the circumstances were unusual." "Unusual how?" "Your father called me in a panic, saying he'd received a notice from the insurance company about a policy lapse due to non-payment. He asked me to help him update his beneficiary information to prevent any further administrative problems." Lisa leaned forward. "Did he say why he was changing the beneficiary to his brother?" "He said Mark had offered to help manage his affairs as he got older, and that it would be easier to have everything in one person's name for estate planning purposes. But he seemed confused about the whole thing, which wasn't like him." "Confused? How?" "He kept referring to paperwork that Mark had shown him, but he couldn't explain what it actually said. Your father was a careful reader, always asked detailed questions about financial documents. But that day, he seemed to be repeating explanations that someone else had given him." Lisa and I exchanged glances. "It sounds like Mark manipulated your father into changing the beneficiary," Lisa said, "possibly by creating fake documents or misrepresenting the insurance company's requirements." Richard nodded gravely. "In retrospect, I should have insisted on seeing the documentation myself, but your father trusted Mark completely, and I didn't want to question a family relationship." "What can we do about the life insurance money?" I asked. "We can contest the beneficiary change," Lisa said. "If we can prove it was obtained through fraud or undue influence, the insurance company might reverse the payout. But that will take time, and we'll need solid evidence. What about the money that's already gone to Pinnacle Private Banking? Lisa's expression darkened. That's where things get really complicated. If Mark has fled the country, recovering those funds could be nearly impossible. But let's take this one step at a time. Over the next week, Lisa and her team worked with the methodical precision of a surgical strike, each action calculated to maximum effect. They filed emergency motions to freeze all accounts associated with Mark's name, contacted banks across 3 states to identify assets, petitioned the court to invalidate the power of attorney documents on the grounds that they were signed under false pretenses, and opened a formal probate case for Dad's estate with me as the executor. The legal documents alone filled 2 thick binders, each page dense with the kind of language that made my head spin, but gave me hope that finally, someone was fighting back with the same level of sophistication that Mark had used to deceive me. Meanwhile, I worked with Richard to secure Dad's investment accounts and ensure that no one else could access them without proper court authorization. We changed passwords, updated contact information, and established new security protocols that would prevent anyone from making unauthorized transactions. The breakthrough came on a Friday afternoon during the 2nd week of our legal offensive. Lisa called me with barely contained excitement in her voice, the kind of energy that made me think she'd found something important. "Sarah, you need to get down here right now. We found him, and you're not going to believe what we've uncovered." I raced to her office, where I found her surrounded by printouts and computer screens showing what looked like banking records. "Mark made a crucial mistake," she said, pointing to a transaction history. "He used the Pinnacle Private Banking account to pay his personal credit card bills. That gave us grounds to subpoena the bank records." The documents spread across her desk, told a damning story. The Thompson Family Trust account had received $487,000 in deposits over the past 2 months. Dad's bank accounts, the life insurance payout, and apparently some of Mark's other clients' money. But the withdrawals painted an even more disturbing picture. "Look at this," Lisa said, highlighting a series of transactions. $40,000 to pay off his mortgage, $15,000 to a luxury car dealership, $25,000 to what appears to be a gambling website. He wasn't just stealing your money, he was living off it. Where is he now? That's the best part. He's still in the country, staying at a resort in Florida. Apparently, he thought he could ride out the investigation in style. She handed me a police report. He was arrested this morning. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, media attention, and emotional ups and downs that left me exhausted but hopeful. Mark had been charged with multiple felonies, including theft, fraud, and practicing law without a license. The FBI had gotten involved due to the interstate nature of his crimes and the possibility that other clients had been victimized. The court hearing was scheduled for a gray December morning in the same courthouse where I'd first learned that no probate case had been filed. This time, I walked through those marble corridors with Lisa at my side, and a sense of purpose that had been missing for months. Mark sat at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit, looking smaller and older than I remembered. When our eyes met across the courtroom, I saw a flash of shame before he looked away. The prosecutor, a sharp-dressed woman named Amanda Torres, laid out the case with devastating precision. Bank records, forged documents, testimony from other victims who had come forward after Mark's arrest was reported in the news. Apparently, I wasn't the only family member he'd targeted. There were at least 3 other estate cases where he'd used similar tactics. "Your Honor," Torres said, "the defendant engaged in a systematic pattern of predatory behavior, targeting vulnerable family members during their time of grief. He exploited his position as both a relative and a supposed legal professional to gain access to funds that rightfully belonged to his victims." Mark's attorney, a tired-looking public defender, attempted to argue that Mark had been acting in good faith, that the complicated financial arrangements were legitimate estate planning strategies. But the evidence was overwhelming. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, listened to all the arguments before delivering her verdict. "Mr. Morrison, you have violated not only the law, but the sacred trust that family members place in each other during times of crisis. You preyed upon your own niece when she was most vulnerable, and you did so with premeditation and calculated deception. She sentenced Mark to 6 years in federal prison and ordered him to pay full restitution to all victims. The gavel came, down with a sound that felt like closure. Outside the courthouse, Lisa and I stood on the steps while reporters shouted questions and cameras flashed. I gave a brief statement about the importance of being vigilant against financial elder abuse and estate fraud, but mostly I just wanted to go home. How much of the money can we recover? I asked Lisa as we walked to her car. Most of it, she said with a smile. The FBI froze Mark's assets before he could spend everything. You won't get back the full amount. Some of it was gambled away, or spent on expenses we can't trace. But you should recover about 70% of what was stolen. What about the life insurance? The insurance company has agreed to reverse the beneficiary change and pay out the full amount to you. That process should be completed within 60 days. 6 months later, I was sitting in Dad's kitchen, my kitchen now, with a cup of Colombian dark roast coffee prepared exactly the way he'd taught me, and a pile of documents that represented the successful resolution of his estate. The morning sun streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny celebrations of survival and victory. The house had been officially transferred to my name through a process that had taken 4 months of legal procedures and court appearances. Dad's investment accounts were now generating quarterly income that provided financial security I'd never experienced before. And while I hadn't recovered every dollar that Mark had stolen, some of it had been gambled away on online poker sites. Some spent on luxury items that couldn't be recovered. I had enough to pay off my student loans, cover the mortgage for years to come, and start building the future Dad had wanted for me. The kitchen table where we now sat was the same one where Dad and I had shared countless meals, where I'd done homework under his patient guidance, and where we'd had our last real conversation, just 2 weeks before his sudden death. He'd been talking about his retirement plans, about traveling to Ireland to trace our family's genealogy, about wanting to see me established in a career that would make me proud. The experience had changed me in ways I was still discovering and processing. I'd learned to question authority figures, to demand documentation before signing anything, to trust my instincts when something felt wrong, even if I couldn't immediately articulate why. I'd also learned that family relationships could be weaponized by people who knew exactly which emotional buttons to push, who understood how to exploit grief and vulnerability for personal gain. But I'd also learned about my own strength. 6 months ago, I'd been a grieving 23-year-old who felt overwhelmed by adult responsibilities. Now I was someone who had taken on a corrupt system and won. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Jennifer, calling from Chicago. "How are you doing?" she asked. "Better," I said, and meant it. "I'm thinking about going back to school to finish my master's degree, maybe studying law." Because of what happened with Mark? Partly, but also because I realized how many people are in situations like mine, trusting family members or professionals who take advantage of their vulnerability. Maybe I can help prevent it from happening to others. That sounds like something your dad would be proud of. She was right. Dad had always believed in fighting for what was right, even when it was difficult. He taught me to stand up for myself and others, to question things that didn't make sense, and to never let anyone make me feel small or powerless. Mark had tried to steal more than just money. He'd tried to steal my future, my security, and my faith in family. But in the end, he'd only made me stronger. I finished my coffee and walked to Dad's study, where I'd been slowly going through his papers and personal effects. In the bottom drawer of his desk, I found a letter addressed to me in his careful handwriting. It was dated just a week before his death. "Sarah," it read, "if you're reading this, then something has happened to me, and you're dealing with estate matters. I want you to know that I tried to prepare for every eventuality, but I'm worried that I might have missed something important. Whatever challenges you're facing, remember that you're stronger and smarter than you know. Trust your instincts, ask for help when you need it, And never let anyone convince you that you're not capable of handling your own affairs. I love you, and I'm proud of the woman you've become. Dad. I folded the letter carefully and tucked it into my wallet, next to the business card Lisa had given me on the day we'd first met. Both pieces of paper represented the same thing: people who believed in my ability to fight for what was right. Mark had served 8 months of his sentence when I received a letter from him. It was forwarded through Lisa's office, along with her recommendation that I didn't have to read it if I didn't want to. But I was curious about what he might have to say. The letter was handwritten on prison stationery, filled with apologies and explanations that felt hollow and self-serving. He talked about gambling debts, financial pressure, and bad investments that had put him in an impossible situation. He claimed he'd always intended to pay back the money, that the whole thing had spiraled out of control. None of it mattered. The Mark who had sat in Dad's kitchen and promised to take care of everything, who had looked me in the eye and sworn he would never hurt me. That person had been a performance, a calculated manipulation designed to separate me from my inheritance. Threw the letter away without finishing it. A year later, I was back in school, working toward a law degree with a specialization in elder law and estate planning. My classmates knew my story. It had been covered extensively in the local media as a cautionary tale about financial fraud. But I'd learned to talk about it without the raw emotion that had once made it difficult to discuss. During my internship, at a legal aid clinic, I helped a dozen families navigate similar situations. Most of them had better outcomes than they'd initially feared, but all of them shared the same sense of betrayal and violation that I remembered so well. The work was emotionally demanding, but deeply satisfying. Every case I helped resolve felt like a small victory against the people who preyed on others' trust and vulnerability. One afternoon, I was researching a case involving a suspicious power of attorney when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Sarah, this is Carol, Mark's wife. I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I wanted you to know that I've filed for divorce and I'm starting over. I also wanted to apologize for what Mark did to you. I had no idea, but that doesn't excuse my failure to see what was happening. I hope you're doing well." I stared at the message for a long time before responding. "Carol, you don't owe me an apology. You were a victim too. I hope you're able to rebuild and find happiness." She texted back immediately. "Thank you for your kindness. Your father would be proud of the person you've become." She was right about that. Dad would be proud, not just of my academic achievements or my professional goals, but of my decision to use a terrible experience as a foundation for helping others. The money Mark had stolen had been recovered, the legal proceedings had been resolved, and justice had been served. But the real victory was subtler and more personal. I had learned to trust myself, to fight for what was right, and to turn pain into purpose. As I walked across campus that evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, I thought about the girl who had stood in that funeral home a year and a half ago, overwhelmed by grief and desperate for someone to take care of everything. She had been naive and trusting, but she hadn't been weak. When the moment came to fight for her future, she had found the strength to do it. And now, she was building a life her father would have admired, one dedicated to protecting others from the kind of betrayal she had experienced, and ensuring that trust was never again used as a weapon against the people brave enough to offer it. The story of Mark's theft would always be part of my history, but it was no longer the defining chapter. Instead, it had become the foundation for everything that came after: the education, the career, the commitment to justice, and the quiet confidence that came from knowing I could handle whatever challenges life decided to throw at me. Dad had always said that the measure of a person wasn't whether they faced adversity, but how they chose to respond to it. I'd faced mine, and I'd chosen to fight back, and I'd won.